I can't save this aircraft. Captain James Brennan's voice cracked over the intercom as 198 passengers began writing final messages to their families. But in seat 22A, a 12-year-old girl pulled off her headphones and stood up. She'd crashed this exact scenario 64 times in simulation. Today, she'd survive it for real, or die trying. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The afternoon sun streamed through the oval window of seat 22A, painting golden rectangles across Zara Mitchell's faded NASA t-shirt. She adjusted her noise-canceling headphones and tapped the screen of her tablet, watching the digital altimeter climb. 20,000 feet. Perfect cruising altitude. Her fingers moved across the controls with practiced precision, trimming the aircraft, adjusting heading, monitoring systems that most 12-year-olds wouldn't even recognize. To the businessman in 22B, she was just another kid playing games. He'd glanced at her screen during boarding, saw airplane graphics, thought, cute, kids these days, and returned to his spreadsheet without a second thought. The flight attendant who'd brought her ginger ale 10 minutes ago had smiled warmly, checking on the unaccompanied minor with the kind of gentle concern reserved for children traveling alone. Nobody looked closely enough to see that Zara wasn't playing. She was training. Her reflection in the dark screen between simulation runs showed a girl small for her age, messy brown hair pulled into a loose ponytail that was already coming undone, dark circles under eyes that had seen too many cockpit voice recorder transcripts. The t-shirt had been her father's gift 2 years and 3 months ago, 3 weeks before Captain David Mitchell's 737 went down in conditions the NTSB report would later call survivable with proper emergency response. Pilot error, they'd ruled. Her father's error. Zara had read that report 347 times. She'd memorized every technical detail, every missed procedure, every second where a different choice might have changed everything. Then she'd started learning. Professional flight simulators downloaded to her tablet and laptop. Restricted aviation databases accessed through methods she'd learned in forums where real pilots shared real knowledge. 3 years of obsession, 3 years of flying this exact aircraft on this exact route through every conceivable nightmare scenario. She'd crashed 847 times. Each crash taught her something her father hadn't known. The memory of that day still burned like acid in her chest. She'd been at school, 9th period algebra, when the principal came to get her. The expression on his face had told her everything before he'd spoken a word. Her mother had been waiting in the office, mascara streaked down her cheeks, unable to form coherent sentences. A police officer with kind eyes had driven them home, the radio carefully turned off so they wouldn't hear the news reports that were already calling it pilot error, before the investigation had even begun. That night, Zara had pulled up everything she could find about her father's accident. The flight data recorder information that had been leaked online. The preliminary reports. The speculation from aviation experts. She'd read it all with a detachment that scared her mother, taking notes, highlighting inconsistencies, trying to understand the sequence of decisions that had led to the crash. Her father had been a good pilot. Everyone said so. 20 years of flying, impeccable safety record, beloved by his crew. But on that Tuesday afternoon, systems had failed in a way he hadn't trained for, hadn't prepared for, hadn't even imagined. And in the 7 minutes between the first alarm and impact, he'd made 3 decisions that seemed reasonable but were actually fatal. Zara had learned what those decisions should have been. And then she'd learned what to do in every other scenario where reasonable decisions weren't enough. Southwest Flight 447, Phoenix to Denver, was routine. She'd checked the weather, the NOTAMs, the aircraft registration before boarding. Boeing 737-800, well-maintained, veteran crew. The statistical probability of incident was negligible. But statistics hadn't saved her father, and Zara trusted preparation more than probability. She ran another simulation on her tablet. Cargo fire at cruising altitude, electrical cascade failure, hydraulic degradation. She'd attempted this scenario 67 times over the past year. Survived 3 times. The math wasn't encouraging, but she couldn't stop trying to beat it, couldn't stop searching for the sequence of decisions that would bring everyone home. The aircraft hummed around her, steady and sure. In the cockpit, Captain James Brennan was probably talking to his first officer about something mundane. Grandkids or golf or weekend plans. 28 years of flying had made routine into meditation for pilots like Brennan. Zara had read his safety record, impeccable. He'd handled engine failures, bird strikes, hydraulic problems, even a landing gear malfunction in 2019 that earned him a commendation. But he'd never faced what was about to happen. None of them had. Around her, Southwest Flight 447 carried its cargo of ordinary lives. The businessman in 22B, Marcus Webb, was reviewing quarterly projections, occasionally glancing at photos of his 2 daughters on his phone. Across the aisle in 22C, a young mother named Jennifer Park bounced her 6-month-old son on her lap, singing softly to keep him entertained. Behind Zara, retired teachers Harold and Margaret Chin held hands the way they had for 53 years of marriage, discussing their granddaughter's upcoming wedding. 3 rows up, college student Tyler Rodriguez listened to music, dreaming about the internship interview waiting for him in Denver. In the back, off-duty nurse Patricia Williams mentally reviewed her schedule for tomorrow's shift. 198 people. 198 lives about to intersect with catastrophe. Zara saved her simulation progress and pulled up a technical manual on her tablet. She was deep into a section about backup hydraulic systems when the first alarm sounded. The fire alarm in the cargo hold began screaming at 2:47 p.m. Mountain Time. In the cockpit, Captain Brennan's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. First Officer Sarah Chen's hand shot to the alarm panel, fingers dancing across controls with the automatic precision of training and muscle memory. Cargo fire, aft hold, Chen reported, voice steady but tight. Initiating suppression. Brennan set down his coffee and reached for the fire suppression controls. His movements were calm, methodical. Cargo fires were serious but manageable. The aircraft had multiple redundant systems designed for exactly this scenario. Discharge the suppression agent, cut off oxygen, monitor temperature, prepare for precautionary landing. He'd trained for this. Every pilot trained for this. He pressed the discharge button. Nothing happened. Suppression system not responding, Chen said, and now there was an edge in her voice that Brennan recognized from his early years of flying. Fear, carefully controlled but present. Brennan tried the backup. Then the emergency override. Status lights that should have illuminated stayed dark. Temperature readings in the cargo hold climbed rapidly, 300 degrees, 400, 500, accelerating with a speed that suggested the fire was feeding on something highly flammable. It's spreading, Chen whispered. Captain, it's spreading fast. Brennan felt the first flutter of real fear in his chest. In 28 years, he'd never seen a cargo suppression system fail completely. The redundancy was built into the design. It shouldn't be possible. That's when the smoke began filtering into the cabin. Zara smelled it before she saw it, acrid, chemical, wrong. She pulled off her headphones as the first wisps of gray smoke curled from the ventilation panels overhead. Around her, passengers began noticing. Coughs. Concerned murmurs. A child's cry of fear. Marcus Webb looked up from his spreadsheet, confusion crossing his face. Is that smoke? The smoke thickened rapidly, faster than seemed possible, spreading through the cabin like something alive and predatory. Flight attendants emerged from the galley, trying to project calm even as their eyes widened at the volume of smoke pouring through the vents. Rebecca, the senior flight attendant, grabbed the intercom handset, then paused, uncertain what to say. The smoke was too thick, too fast, too wrong to be explained by standard reassurances. Zara's heart began to race. She knew this smell from accident reports, from NTSB findings, from the technical breakdown of what had filled her father's cockpit in his final moments. Electrical fire. Insulation burning. Wiring melting through multiple systems. This wasn't a contained cargo fire. This was systemic failure in progress. Jennifer Park pulled her baby close, covering his face with her hand. Harold Chen squeezed his wife's hand tighter, both of them silent but exchanging a look that spoke volumes of shared fear. Tyler Rodriguez pulled out his earbuds, sitting up straight, young enough to think maybe this was nothing but old enough to know better. This was bad. This was very bad. In the cockpit, alarms began cascading like dominoes falling in accelerating sequence. Navigation systems flickered and died, displays going dark in sections. The autopilot disengaged with a violent lurch that threw the aircraft into a 15-degree roll, coffee spilling across Brennan's console. He grabbed the controls, fighting to level the wings as more systems crashed around him. "We're losing electrical," Chen gasped, watching her displays die one by one like lights going out across a city during a blackout. "Primary bus down. Backup bus failing. Hydraulics showing degradation, Captain, this isn't possible. We have triple redundancy." "I see it," Brennan said, his voice tight. His hands moved across controls that suddenly felt foreign, unresponsive. The aircraft was fighting him in ways it shouldn't, in ways it couldn't unless multiple systems were failing simultaneously. "Mayday, mayday, mayday," Brennan transmitted, forcing his voice to remain controlled by decades of training. "Denver Center, Southwest 447, we have cargo fire, multiple system failures, losing control authority, requesting immediate emergency vectors." The radio died mid-sentence. Just cut off, along with the transponder and every other communications system. Total communications failure. For 3 seconds, Brennan and Chen stared at their failing instruments in silence. The only sounds were alarms, the crackle of dying electrical systems, and their own breathing. Then Chen's voice, barely audible over the chaos, "What do we do?" Brennan's hands moved through emergency procedures with mechanical precision born of thousands of hours in simulators and actual cockpits. "Isolate electrical systems. Try manual overrides. Engage backup controls." His fingers found switches he'd practiced finding blindfolded in training, executed procedures he'd repeated until they were muscle memory. But everything felt wrong. The aircraft wasn't responding correctly. Controls were sluggish, delayed, degrading by the second. When he pulled back on the yoke, the nose came up but slowly, too slowly, with a mushiness that suggested hydraulic pressure was dropping. He'd trained for engine failures. He'd trained for hydraulic problems. He'd trained for electrical fires. He'd even trained for worst-case scenarios that instructors assured him with knowing smiles would never actually happen. But this, simultaneous cargo fire with suppression failure, electrical cascade across multiple buses, communication loss, progressive control degradation at 20,000 feet with a cabin full of smoke, this was the nightmare that existed only in theoretical discussions and accident investigation reports. The scenario where the manual used phrases like, "maintain aircraft control if possible," and, "attempt emergency landing at nearest suitable airport," and other carefully worded instructions that basically meant, "good luck, you'll need it." The scenarios where the little yellow highlight in the report summary said, "fatal accident." His hands started shaking. He glanced at Chen and saw his own fear reflected in her face. She was 32, brilliant, had aced every evaluation. This should have been a routine flight, the kind of milk run that paid the bills while she built hours toward her captain upgrade. Instead, she was watching her instruments die and trying to remember if she'd told her husband she loved him before leaving for the airport that morning. "Try the secondary hydraulic pump," Brennan said, grasping for anything. "Maybe we can." An explosion of sparks from the overhead panel. Both pilots flinched as acrid smoke filled the cockpit. More systems died. The primary flight display went completely dark. Chen's voice cracked, "Captain, I don't think we can save this." Brennan opened his mouth to respond, to offer some reassurance, some plan. But the words wouldn't come. Because she was right. For the first time in 28 years of flying, Captain James Brennan looked at his dying aircraft and realized he was out of options. They were going to crash. And there was nothing he could do about it. The oxygen masks deployed with a hiss of pressurized air and a rain of plastic panels. Passengers screamed. Parents grabbed for their children. Marcus Webb fumbled with his mask, hands trembling, lips moving in silent prayer. His last thought before panic overwhelmed him was of his daughters, Emily, 7, and Grace, 5, and how they'd remember him. The smoke was everywhere now, thick enough to blur the rows ahead, to make breathing difficult even with the masks. Emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red. Jennifer Park's baby wailed somewhere behind Zara, the sound piercing through the chaos, primal and terrifying. Harold Chen held his wife close, both of them calm in the way that comes from accepting the inevitable. The captain's voice came over the intercom, and Zara's blood went cold. She'd listened to enough cockpit voice recordings to recognize the sound of a pilot who'd run out of options. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a serious emergency." Brennan's voice shook despite his obvious effort to control it. "We're experiencing multiple system failures. We're attempting emergency landing procedures. Please ensure your masks are secure, assume brace positions, and follow all crew instructions." What he didn't say spoke louder than his words. He didn't say, "We'll be fine." He didn't give an estimated time to landing. He didn't offer the reassuring platitudes that pilots use to keep passengers calm during manageable emergencies. He didn't say, "We're trained for this," or "We've got this under control." He didn't say those things because he didn't believe them. Zara could hear her father's voice in Brennan's tone. That same quality of desperate professionalism, trying to maintain authority while facing the unthinkable. She'd heard it in the cockpit voice recording from her father's crash, the one she'd obtained through channels she'd never explained to her mother. Those final 7 minutes where a good pilot tried everything he knew and discovered it wasn't enough. Around her, passengers were saying goodbyes. Marcus Webb clutched his phone, staring at a photo of his daughters, tears streaming down his face. He typed frantically, "I love you both so much. Be good for mommy. Remember Daddy loves you." His finger hovered over the send button, wondering if the message would go through, if it would matter, if they'd understand. Jennifer Park held her baby close, whispering, "I love you, I love you, I love you," like a prayer or a spell that might keep them safe. The baby had stopped crying, sensing his mother's fear in the way infants do, going quiet and still. Behind Zara, Harold Chen spoke softly to his wife, "It's been a wonderful life, hasn't it? No regrets." Margaret nodded, tears on her weathered cheeks but her voice steady, "No regrets. I'd do it all again." They held hands, eyes closed, faces peaceful with a kind of acceptance that came from 53 years of shared life. Tyler Rodriguez had his phone out, recording a video message for his parents, "Mom, Dad, I don't know if you'll see this, but I love you. Tell everyone I love them. I'm scared but," his voice broke. He was 19 years old. He'd never been in love. He'd never finished college. He'd never done any of the things he'd assumed he'd have time for. They all thought they were going to die. They were probably right. Statistical survival rates for the scenario unfolding around them were effectively zero. Multiple cascading system failures. Loss of control authority. Smoke-filled cabin. 20,000 feet with nowhere to land. Unless. Zara looked at her tablet screen. The simulation was still running, frozen on the scenario she'd been practicing. Cargo fire at cruising altitude. Electrical cascade failure. Hydraulic degradation. 20,000 feet. She'd flown this scenario 67 times. She'd crashed 64 times, learning something new from each failure. Why pulling up too aggressively stalled the aircraft? Why deploying flaps too early caused unrecoverable loss of control? Why certain sequences of actions led to cascading failures while other sequences preserved just enough functionality to survive? But she'd also survived 3 times. 3 different approaches, 3 different sequences of decisions, 3 different ways to thread the impossible needle between certain death and possible survival. 3 times out of 67. 4.5% success rate. Those weren't good odds. But they were better than 0%. And 0 was what Captain Brennan had right now. Zara unbuckled her seatbelt and stood. Her legs felt unsteady, whether from fear or the aircraft's erratic movements she couldn't tell. Around her, passengers were too focused on their own terror to notice a child standing up. She took a breath of the acrid air, tasted smoke and fear and burning insulation, and started toward the front of the cabin. A flight attendant materialized through the smoke, grabbing her shoulder. Zara recognized her. Rebecca, mid-40s, kind eyes, had been so sweet during boarding. Now Rebecca's eyes were red from crying, her carefully maintained professional composure cracking like ice under pressure. "Sit down, sweetheart, please," Rebecca said, trying to guide her back toward 22A. "You need to stay in your seat with your mask on. I need to talk to the pilots." Rebecca shook her head, confusion and fear warring on her face. "You can't. The cockpit is sealed. It's procedure during emergencies. Please, honey, just sit down and I know how to fix this." Zara's voice came out steady, unnaturally calm for a 12-year-old on a dying aircraft. The calmness scared her a little. She sounded like her father, like the recordings of him on routine flights, professional and certain. Rebecca stared at her like she'd spoken in a foreign language. "What?" "The emergency they're facing. I've flown it 67 times in professional flight simulators. I know this aircraft. I know these systems. I know what's failing and what they need to do to survive." Zara met the flight attendant's eyes directly, willing her to understand. "My father died in a crash like this 2 years ago. Captain David Mitchell. Southwest Flight 1842. I've spent every day since learning everything about how these aircraft fail and how to save them. Please. Let me try." The words hung in the smoke-filled air between them. Around them, passengers screamed and prayed and said goodbye. Above them, somewhere in the cockpit, 2 pilots were running out of time and options. The aircraft shuddered, dropping suddenly before catching itself, and several passengers vomited into their oxygen masks. Rebecca looked at this small girl with messy hair and a NASA t-shirt, claiming she could save 198 people, and had to make an impossible choice. Protocol said no. FAA regulations said no. Common sense said no. Every rule and procedure and guideline she'd learned in 20 years of flying said absolutely not. "This is insane, this child needs to sit down and put her mask back on." But they were falling out of the sky and the pilots had already admitted they were out of options, and what did protocol matter when everyone was going to die anyway? Rebecca made a choice. She grabbed Zara's hand and pulled her toward the cockpit, dodging panicked passengers, and pounded on the reinforced door with her fist. "Captain. Captain Brennan." She kept pounding, praying they could hear over the alarms. "I have someone who can help." The door opened 6 inches. Captain Brennan's face appeared, haggard and streaked with sweat, eyes wild with the kind of fear that came from facing the unfaceable. His gaze went from Rebecca to Zara, confusion and something like horror crossing his features. "What?" "Rebecca, what are you?" "Get her back to her seat." "What are you thinking?" "Captain, she says she can help. She's a child." Brennan's voice cracked. "Get her out of here. Get her back to Captain Brennan, sir," Zara said, and her voice cut through his panic with unexpected authority. "My name is Zara Mitchell. My father was Captain David Mitchell, Southwest Airlines. He died 2 years ago in a 737-800 crash. Flight 1842. The NTSB ruled it pilot error, but it was actually a scenario he wasn't prepared for. Since then, I've logged 2,400 hours on professional-grade flight simulators. I've flown this exact aircraft on this exact route through every possible failure scenario I could research or imagine. Brennan stared at her, his brain struggling to process her words while alarms screamed around him. You're 12 years old playing video games. I'm 12 years old who's spent 3 years learning everything about how your aircraft fails and how to save it. Zara stepped closer, forcing him to really look at her. Sir, you're experiencing electrical cascade failure originating from a cargo fire that breached your aft electrical bay. Your primary hydraulics are degrading because heat from the fire is affecting fluid pressure and seals. Your backup systems are failing because they share corrupted electrical buses. You've lost communications because your transponder and radio share the same compromised circuit. Your flight controls are becoming unresponsive because you're losing both hydraulic pressure and electrical power to the fly-by-wire systems. Brennan's face went pale. Every word she'd said was exactly correct. How do you? Because I've crashed this scenario 64 times learning exactly why aircraft don't survive it. But I've also survived it 3 times, sir. 3 times. Zara's voice carried absolute certainty now. In approximately 90 seconds, your remaining hydraulic system will fail completely. When it does, you'll have zero control surface authority. But if you switch to manual trim right now and dump cabin pressure to reduce electrical load, you can maintain partial elevator control long enough to reach an emergency landing site. First Officer Chen appeared beside Brennan, her face desperate. Captain, we've got nothing. Every procedure has failed. Every backup is gone. Maybe we should. She's 12. Brennan's voice broke completely. She can't possibly know, she hasn't trained, she's just a child who. I can possibly because I've done it. Zara's voice was her father's voice now, the one he'd used when making command decisions in the cockpit, calm and absolutely certain even when facing the impossible. Captain Brennan, you're a good pilot. One of the best. Your record proves it. But you've never seen this specific scenario. Nobody has, not in real life. It exists in the space between what's supposed to be impossible and what's technically survivable. Training doesn't prepare you for it because it's not supposed to happen. She paused, letting that sink in. I've seen it 67 times. I've died in it 64 times. But I've also survived it 3 times. That's 3 more times than anyone else in this cockpit. That's 3 more times than the statistical probability says is possible. What? Brennan's voice was barely a whisper. What makes you think you can do what I can't? Because my father couldn't either, and I've spent 3 years learning why. Zara's eyes held his. Sir, you have 75 seconds now. There's an abandoned airstrip 40 miles southeast of our current position. It's 5,200 feet long, uncontrolled, rough surface, probably hasn't seen maintenance in a decade. But it's within your gliding range if you act now. If you wait, you'll lose the control authority you need to reach it. If you try for a major airport, you won't make it, they're all too far and you need working systems to land at them safely. Brennan felt something break inside him. The realization that he was beaten. That his 28 years of experience weren't enough. That everything he knew, everything he'd learned, every emergency procedure he'd memorized, none of it was enough to save the people behind that cockpit door. How do you know about that airstrip? He whispered. Because I memorized every possible landing site within gliding range of this entire route. Zara spoke quickly now, aware of time slipping away. The primary options, Denver International, Colorado Springs, Front Range, they all require functional communications and working control systems. You have neither. They're also too far given your current degradation rate. The emergency strip is your only chance. It was built in the 1960s for military training, decommissioned in 1993, but the runway is still there. Google Earth shows it's overgrown but intact. Chen turned to Brennan, tears streaming down her face. Captain, please. We have to try something. 65 seconds, Zara said quietly. The cockpit fell silent except for the wail of alarms and the crackle of failing systems. Brennan looked at Chen. Chen looked at the dying instruments. Neither of them had a better option. Neither of them had any option. Brennan thought of his grandson's baseball game he promised to attend next week. His wife who'd kissed him goodbye that morning, just like every morning for 33 years. The 198 people in the cabin behind him who'd trusted him to bring them home safely. He thought of Captain David Mitchell, whose name he vaguely remembered from industry news 2 years ago. Another good pilot gone, another family destroyed, another investigation blaming the dead. He looked at the dead man's daughter standing in his cockpit, this impossible child with her impossible knowledge, offering an impossible solution. "Let her in," Brennan said quietly. "Chen, open the door. Let her in." The cockpit was a nightmare of flashing warnings and dead screens. Smoke curled through the air vents. Half the instruments showed nothing but darkness. The other half showed systems failing in real time, red lights cascading like falling dominoes. Zara climbed into the jump seat, her small frame dwarfed by equipment designed for adults. She could barely see over the instrument panel, but she didn't need to see everything. She'd memorized the layout from technical manuals and simulator practice. She knew where every control was, what every indicator meant, which backup systems existed and how to activate them. "Manual trim," she said, her voice cutting through the alarm noise. "Now. Disconnect the autopilot remnants and switch to full manual trim control." Chen's hands moved toward the trim controls, then hesitated. "Captain." Brennan closed his eyes for a moment. Opened them. Nodded once. The aircraft shuddered violently as Chen disengaged automated systems and switched to manual control. Immediately the nose wanted to drop as degraded hydraulics struggled to maintain pressure against control surface resistance. Brennan fought the yoke, pulling back, feeling it respond sluggishly. "Good," Zara said, watching the instruments she could see and extrapolating the ones she couldn't. "Now dump cabin pressure. Emergency depressurization. Do it manually, don't trust the automated systems." "That will, the passengers," Chen started, horror in her voice. Deliberate depressurization went against every instinct. "The passengers have oxygen masks. They're already breathing from them. You need to kill electrical load on everything non-essential." Zara spoke quickly but clearly. "Cabin pressure systems, cabin lighting, entertainment systems, galley power, air conditioning, anything that draws power from the electrical buses. Route all available power to flight controls only. You're about to lose total hydraulic pressure, but if you isolate power now, you can maintain manual control through trim tabs and direct cable linkage." Brennan's hand hovered over the controls. Depressurizing the cabin deliberately was against every procedure, every regulation, every instinct developed over decades of flying. But he'd already crossed the line by letting a child into his cockpit during an emergency. Might as well see where this impossible path led. He initiated emergency depressurization. The aircraft groaned. Passengers in the cabin felt their ears pop painfully. The remaining cabin lights flickered and died. But in the cockpit, the electrical system load dropped significantly. The groaning, struggling electrical system stabilized slightly. Control response improved marginally. It wasn't much. But it was something. "Okay," Zara said, and her voice carried a weight that didn't belong to someone who should be in 7th grade. "Now kill the APU. Kill all cabin systems. Kill everything except pitch, roll, and rudder control. You're about to lose hydraulics completely, but if you isolate power and switch to manual cable controls now, you can maintain enough control surface authority to glide." "If we kill that much," Chen said, her voice shaking, "we'll have no lights, no instruments, nothing. You'll have attitude indicator and airspeed. That's enough. You'll also have manual control through cable tension instead of hydraulic pressure. It'll feel wrong, it'll be sluggish, but it'll work." Zara leaned forward, looking at the overhead panel. Kill the electrical load or lose everything. Choose. Brennan and Chen exchanged one long look. A lifetime of training said don't do this. But their training had already failed them. Every procedure they tried had made no difference. They were still dying. Maybe it was time to trust someone whose training was different. Working in silent coordination, they began shutting down systems. One by one, the cockpit displays went dark. The last of the cabin lighting died, plunging the passengers into darkness broken only by emergency floor lighting. The comfortable hum of air conditioning ceased. Temperature began rising immediately. But the critical flight controls stabilized. The yoke still felt mushy, imprecise, but it responded. When Brennan pulled back, the nose came up. When he pushed left, the aircraft banked. The response was delayed, weak, nothing like normal flight. But it was response. Now, Zara said quietly, pulling out her tablet and bringing up a navigation map she'd cached for offline use, now we glide. 12 minutes. That's what Zara calculated they had to reach the emergency airstrip before they either ran out of altitude or the fire reached something truly catastrophic like fuel lines or wing structural members. 12 minutes to cover 40 miles with failing controls, smoke filling every space, and 198 terrified people in the cabin sitting in darkness and wondering if each breath would be their last. Heading 135, Zara said, checking her tablet's GPS against the cockpit compass, one of the few instruments still working. You need to turn right approximately 25 degrees. 4 degrees nose down. Minimize drag, clean configuration, no speed brakes, no gear, maintain 210 knots airspeed. Brennan's hands moved to comply, and he was surprised to find the aircraft responding. Barely. The controls felt loose, imprecise, like trying to steer a car with worn-out power steering through thick mud. But they responded. The aircraft began a slow, shallow turn to the right. Too slow. Zara watched the heading indicator barely move. More rudder, she said. The hydraulics for aileron control are nearly gone. You need to use rudder to initiate the turn, then hold it with aileron once you've established bank. Brennan pressed right rudder. The aircraft yawed right, then began banking as air pressure over the wings created roll. He corrected with left aileron to stop the bank at 20 degrees, then held it steady. The turn continued, slow but steady, the heading indicator finally moving toward 135. How do you know this will work? Brennan asked, his voice tight with concentration. I don't, Zara admitted, and her honesty was somehow more reassuring than false confidence would have been. In simulation, I survived this approach once out of 23 attempts. But it's the only approach that ever worked. Every other strategy, trying for a major airport, attempting a highway landing, going for a water ditching, they all failed 100% of the time. Chen made a small sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. 1 out of 23. That's our odds. That's better than 1 out of infinity, Zara said. Which is what you had before I got here. They flew in tense silence for 3 minutes, Brennan and Chen making tiny adjustments as Zara called corrections. The aircraft wanted to roll left, asymmetric drag from damaged systems on the right side. Zara compensated with opposite rudder trim. Airspeed started bleeding off too fast as the nose came up slightly, she called for a steeper descent angle, trading altitude for speed. The fire warning continued screaming its monotone alarm, she told them to ignore it because there was nothing they could do about the fire anyway and focusing on it would just make them panic. She was guiding them through a disaster the same way she'd guided herself through 67 simulations. Each small problem identified. Each solution applied. Each adjustment made. Building toward the possibility of survival one decision at a time. In the cabin behind them, passengers huddled in darkness and smoke, oxygen masks pressed to their faces, praying to whatever gods they believed in or had forgotten about until this moment. They didn't know a 12-year-old was flying their aircraft. They didn't know she'd crashed this scenario 64 times before figuring out how to survive it. They only knew they were still in the air when they should have been falling. Marcus Webb had given up praying and was thinking about his daughters. Trying to memorize every detail of their faces from the photo on his phone, as if his memory might somehow persist beyond death. Emily's gap-toothed smile. Grace's habit of twirling her hair when she was thinking. Jennifer Park had stopped whispering to her baby and was just holding him, feeling his heartbeat against her chest, trying to memorize the weight of him, the smell of him, the complete perfection of this small life she'd created. Harold and Margaret Chen sat in peaceful silence, hands intertwined, each grateful that if this was the end, at least they were together. 53 years of marriage, of partnership, of shared life. Not a bad run, all things considered. Tyler Rodriguez had stopped recording videos and was just sitting with his eyes closed, trying to make peace with dying at 19. It seemed unfair, seemed wrong, but the universe didn't care about fair. Patricia Williams, the off-duty nurse, had her medical training kicking in despite the situation. She was mentally triaging the cabin, identifying passengers who might need immediate help if, when, they crashed. Keeping her mind occupied with professional competence because that was better than thinking about her own mortality. At 10,000 feet, visibility improved slightly as they descended below the worst of the smoke layer. Chen spotted something through the windscreen, squinting against the glare of afternoon sun. Is that? The airstrip, Zara confirmed, checking her tablet's GPS coordinates against what they could see. 2 o'clock, approximately 15 miles. It looks like a scratch in the desert from here, but it'll get bigger. She was right. As they descended, the thin ribbon of concrete became more visible, surrounded by scrub brush and scattered trees. It looked impossibly small, impossibly far away, impossibly inadequate for landing a 154-foot-long aircraft traveling at 200 knots. It's too short, Chen whispered. Captain, we'll never stop in time. We will, Zara said with certainty she didn't entirely feel. The runway is 5,200 feet. At your current weight and with maximum braking, you need approximately 4,800 feet. You have 400 feet of margin. That's assuming everything works perfectly, Brennan said. Assuming the brakes respond, assuming the tires don't blow, assuming the runway surface is intact. Assuming we make it there at all, Zara interrupted. Sir, with respect, we're way past assumptions. We're in the realm of hoping and doing our best. The runway is long enough if you execute the landing correctly. And you will, because I'm going to tell you exactly how. At 5,000 feet, the terrain below became clearer. Rocky desert dotted with vegetation, gullies cutting through the landscape, mountains in the distance. The airstrip was definitely visible now, a strip of cracked concrete that time and weather had broken into segments, weeds growing through the gaps, but still fundamentally intact and flat. Start your approach planning, Zara said. You'll come in from the east, over that lower terrain. It gives you the best glide path and keeps you away from the higher ground to the north. You'll need full flaps on final, but don't deploy until 500 feet or the extra drag will stall you with these compromised controls. Brennan's hands moved through the approach mentally, visualizing it the way he'd visualized thousands of landings over his career. Except this time he had almost no instruments, no hydraulics, no radio, no backup. Just cable-controlled surfaces, a glide slope, and a 12-year-old's instructions. The winds are from the west at approximately 10 knots, Zara continued, checking a weather app on her tablet that had cached the last data before they lost signal. That's a crosswind on your approach. You'll need to crab angle until the last moment, then align with rudder. With your control degradation, you get one chance at that alignment. If you miss it, you won't have the authority to correct. That's comforting, Chen muttered. It's honest, Zara replied. I'm not here to comfort you. I'm here to get us on the ground alive. At 3,000 feet, individual details became visible. The runway had sections that looked intact and sections that were clearly broken. There were tire marks on one end, someone had used it relatively recently, probably teenagers with off-road vehicles having fun. The landing zone was rougher than ideal but usable. Trees lined one side of the runway, probably planted decades ago as windbreaks. They'd grown tall over the years. If the aircraft drifted off the runway, those trees would tear them apart. "I can't do this," Brennan said quietly. "I can't land this aircraft on that strip with these controls. It's impossible." Chen turned to look at him, her eyes wide. In all their time flying together, she'd never heard Captain Brennan say anything was impossible. Zara leaned forward in her jump seat, making Brennan look at her. "Captain, my father died because when he faced an impossible situation, he froze. Not because he was a bad pilot or a coward, but because his brain couldn't process that all his training had failed him. He spent precious seconds trying procedures that didn't work instead of trying something new." She paused, letting that sink in. "You're not going to freeze. You're not going to give up. You're going to listen to me, you're going to trust your hands, and you're going to land this aircraft. Because impossible just means nobody's done it before. And nobody's been in this exact situation before." "How are you so calm?" Brennan asked, his voice breaking. "Because I've already died 64 times, Zara said simply. "I've felt this aircraft stall and spin. I've watched the ground rush up and everything go black. I've crashed so many times that crashing doesn't scare me anymore. What scares me is not trying. What scares me is giving up when there's still a chance." She looked at the approaching runway. "You have a chance, Captain. Now take it." At 2,000 feet, Brennan began his final approach. His hands were steady now, guided by muscle memory and decades of experience. Zara called small corrections: more right rudder, ease back on the yoke, watch your airspeed, and he followed them without question. At 1,000 feet, a crosswind gust caught them, pushing the aircraft 20 degrees off centerline. The nose swung right. Chen gasped, certain they'd missed the runway entirely, that they'd slam into the desert or the trees or anything but that tiny strip of concrete. "Crab angle," Zara said, her voice cutting through Chen's panic. "Maintain it. You're compensating for wind. Don't try to align yet, you'll lose the compensation and drift worse. Hold this angle until 50 feet, then use rudder to straighten out. You've got enough control authority for one correction. Make it count." Brennan held the crab, the aircraft flying sideways relative to the runway below, every instinct screaming at him to fix it, to align, to make it look right. But he trusted Zara. He held the ugly, wrong-looking approach because she'd told him to. At 500 feet, he deployed flaps. The aircraft shuddered violently. The nose dropped. Chen's hand shot to the yoke, instinctively trying to help pull back. The aircraft wallowed, sluggish, the extra drag from the flaps fighting against the already compromised controls. "Steady," Zara said. "Don't overcompensate. Let the aircraft settle. There. You've got it. Trim up 2 clicks to compensate for the flap drag. There. Perfect. Hold this angle. Aim for the first 500 feet of runway. You'll need every inch." At 300 feet, the ground below became individual rocks and bushes. They were committed now. No going around. No second chance. This was it. At 100 feet, they were coming in too fast, too steep, off centerline, with a crosswind pushing them further right. Every instinct, every procedure, every hour of training screamed at Brennan that this was wrong, this was going to crash, they needed to abort. But there was nothing to abort to. This was the only option. "Trust," Zara whispered, and her voice was her father's voice, was the voice of every pilot who'd ever faced the impossible and tried anyway. At 50 feet, Brennan kicked right rudder, swinging the nose to align with the runway. The aircraft wallowed, resistant, sluggish with degraded controls. The nose swung slowly, too slowly. Were they going to make it? The runway rushed up, close enough to see individual cracks in the concrete. At 30 feet, the nose aligned. Not perfectly, but close enough. The aircraft was still drifting right from the crosswind but pointing down the runway's centerline. At 10 feet, Brennan pulled back slightly on the yoke, flaring for landing. The nose came up. The main wheels dropped toward the concrete. And everything happened at once. The main wheels hit with an impact that shook the entire aircraft. Landing gear shrieked. Metal groaned. Something in the aft section made a terrible crunching sound. Brennan stood on the brakes, deploying every remaining control surface, spoilers coming up to kill lift, thrust reversers engaging on whatever engines still responded. The aircraft bounced, came down again harder, bounced again. They were decelerating but not enough, not fast enough. The end of the runway rushed toward them like a wall. Beyond it, trees. Beyond the trees, rocky desert. Beyond the desert, death. Emergency ground spoilers, Zara said, her voice still calm somehow. Full reverse thrust on whatever engines still respond. Manual braking to maximum, don't trust the anti-skid system. Chen's hands flew across controls, deploying everything, pulling every lever, pressing every button that might help. The aircraft shuddered, groaned, the brakes screaming as the wheels locked and skidded on the rough concrete. 50 feet from the end of the runway. 40. They weren't going to stop. After everything, all the impossible decisions and desperate flying and miraculous guidance, they were going to slide off the end and into the trees and crash anyway. 30 feet. Brennan could see individual branches on the trees ahead. Could see the rough desert beyond. Could imagine the impact. 20 feet. 10. The aircraft stopped. The nose wheel was 5 feet from the end of the runway, close enough that Brennan could see where the concrete gave way to dirt and rocks. 5 feet. They'd stopped with 5 feet to spare. For a moment, nobody moved. Complete silence except for the tick of cooling metal, the hiss of escaping hydraulic fluid, the crackle of residual electrical shorts, and the distant wail of the fire that was finally starting to die now that it had nothing left to burn. Brennan's hands were locked on the controls, unable to release them. His entire body was shaking. Chen was crying, tears streaming down her face, her breath coming in gasping sobs. Zara sat in the jump seat, staring at the trees that had stopped inches from the nose, and slowly let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Then, from the cabin, a sound. One passenger started clapping. Then another. Then everyone who could move, who wasn't unconscious from fear or lack of oxygen, who had any strength left, they all started clapping. A thunderous applause that rolled through the aircraft like a wave, like prayer, like disbelief made sound. They were alive. All 198 of them were alive. The emergency door opened and passengers stumbled onto the rough tarmac, gulping fresh air like drowning people finally reaching the surface. Some collapsed immediately onto the hot concrete, unable to stand, their legs too weak from fear and stress. Some laughed hysterically, the kind of laughter that comes from surviving the impossible. Some sat in stunned silence, unable to process that they were actually alive. Marcus Webb fell to his knees on the concrete and kissed the ground, his phone still clutched in his hand with the unsent message to his daughters. He'd get to deliver that message in person. He'd get to see them again. The thought made him sob. Jennifer Park held her baby tight, stumbling away from the aircraft on shaking legs, whispering, "Thank you, thank you, thank you," to whoever might be listening. Her son was crying now, confused by all the chaos, and she'd never heard a more beautiful sound than his frightened wails because it meant he was alive to cry. Harold and Margaret Chen helped each other down the emergency slide, moving slowly, carefully, both of them silent with wonder. 53 years of marriage, and they'd just been given more years together. The gift felt impossible, undeserved, miraculous. Tyler Rodriguez recorded another video message as he walked away from the aircraft. "Mom, Dad, never mind that last message. I'm alive. We all are. I don't know how, but we're alive. I love you. I'm coming home." His hands shook so badly he could barely hold the phone. Patricia Williams moved through the crowd of passengers, her nurse's training taking over, checking people for injuries, treating shock, making sure everyone was okay. She found cuts and bruises and twisted ankles, but nothing serious. Nothing fatal. Everyone was going to be okay. Emergency services arrived within 20 minutes, the aircraft's emergency beacon having activated on impact, giving their position to search and rescue. Fire trucks surrounded the 737, dousing the smoldering cargo hold with foam. The fire had burned itself mostly out during the descent, having consumed everything flammable in the electrical bay and cargo hold, but the firefighters made sure it was completely extinguished. Paramedics checked passengers, treating minor injuries, wrapping blankets around people in shock. News helicopters circled overhead, cameras recording everything. This would be international news within the hour: the impossible landing, the disaster averted, the miracle at 20,000 feet. In the cockpit, Captain Brennan sat unmoving, staring at his hands on the controls. Chen had already exited to help with passenger evacuation, but Brennan couldn't make himself move. Couldn't release his grip on the yoke. Couldn't process what had just happened. He'd been flying for 28 years. He'd handled every kind of emergency the manuals described. He'd always been the person others relied on, the steady hand, the calm voice, the professional who had answers. Today he'd had no answers. Today a 12-year-old had known things he didn't. Had seen solutions he couldn't imagine. Had saved everyone when he'd been ready to give up. Captain. Zara's voice was soft, uncertain, the command authority completely gone now. She sounded like what she was, a frightened child who'd just been through something traumatic. He turned to look at her. Really look at her. A small girl in a faded NASA t-shirt, with messy hair falling out of its ponytail, dark circles under eyes that had seen too much, hands trembling now that the crisis was over. "Who are you?" he whispered. Zara's voice wavered for the first time since she'd entered the cockpit. "Someone who couldn't save her dad. But I could save you." Tears ran down Brennan's face, cutting tracks through the sweat and smoke residue. "Your father would be so proud of you. My father would be alive if he'd known what I know now." Zara unbuckled from the jump seat, her hands fumbling with the straps. "That's why I learned it. So maybe someone else's father wouldn't die. So maybe someone else's kid wouldn't have to read an accident report and wonder if there was something that could have been different." She climbed down from the jump seat, legs shaking now, the adrenaline finally wearing off. "But I'm glad I could help. I'm glad everyone's okay." Brennan watched her walk toward the exit, this impossible child who just saved 198 lives, and couldn't find words adequate for what he was feeling. Gratitude seemed too small. Awe seemed insufficient. She'd been training for 3 years for this moment, had turned her grief into expertise, her helplessness into preparation. And when the moment came, she'd been ready. The investigation took 3 weeks. FAA inspectors, NTSB officials, aviation safety experts, everyone wanted to understand what had happened at 20,000 feet. The cockpit voice recorder provided most of the answers. It had captured everything. Brennan's initial confidence giving way to panic. Chen's fear. The cascade of system failures. Rebecca pounding on the door. Zara's calm instructions. The impossible landing guided by a child. Social media exploded with the story within hours. 12-year-old simulator prodigy saves 198 lives. Child pilot lands dying plane. Girl genius guides emergency landing. The footage from news helicopters showing passengers stumbling from the aircraft went viral. Talking heads on cable news debated child genius versus luck versus divine intervention. Aviation forums dissected every decision Zara had made, analyzing her technique, questioning her methods, ultimately concluding that she'd been technically sound. Some called it miraculous. Others called it impossible. A few called it irresponsible to let a child in the cockpit under any circumstances, regardless of the outcome. But the facts were undeniable. Multiple aviation experts reviewed the scenario and confirmed that Zara's approach was not only technically sound but probably the only approach that could have worked given the circumstances. The emergency airstrip had been within gliding range but only barely. The manual trim and power isolation had maintained just enough control authority to make landing possible. The timing of every decision had been critical. A delay of even 30 seconds at any point would have been fatal. One aeronautical engineering professor from MIT told CNN, "What this child did required not just theoretical knowledge but practical understanding of cascading system failures that most pilots will never encounter in their entire careers." Her decision-making was sound, her technical knowledge was exceptional, and her understanding of aircraft systems was frankly superior to what I see in many commercial pilots. The fact that she's 12 is almost irrelevant to the quality of her emergency response. She knew what she was talking about, and she saved lives with that knowledge. The FAA launched a formal review of how she'd obtained such extensive training. Flight simulator companies were questioned about access protocols and age restrictions. Online forums where pilots shared technical information were investigated for security breaches. Aviation authorities wanted to understand how a child could accumulate 2,400 hours of simulator time and extensive technical knowledge without formal oversight. But ultimately, no laws had been broken. Zara had simply been obsessed, brilliant, and determined enough to teach herself what most people learned in years of formal training and professional experience. She'd downloaded legal simulator software. She'd read publicly available technical manuals. She'd participated in online forums that didn't ask for age verification. She'd taught herself through pure determination and grief-driven motivation. Her mother, who'd watched her daughter's obsession with concern but hadn't understood the depth of it, gave a tearful interview. After David died, Zara closed herself off. She stopped seeing friends. Stopped doing normal kid things. I thought she was just depressed, just grieving. I had no idea she was training. That she was learning all of this. I wish I'd known. I wish I'd understood. She paused, wiping tears. But I'm grateful. I'm so grateful she had this knowledge when it mattered. She saved all those people. She saved herself. David would be so proud. 3 weeks after the emergency landing, a press conference was held at a Denver hotel. Captain Brennan attended, looking older and more tired than his personnel photos suggested. First Officer Chen attended, composed but visibly shaken. Several passengers attended, wanting to thank their saviors in person. And, reluctantly, uncomfortably, Zara attended. She sat at a table far too large for her, wearing a clean NASA t-shirt that had been a duplicate of her father's original gift, her hair finally properly brushed and pulled back. The conference room was packed with reporters, cameras, microphones, lights. She looked overwhelmed by the attention, small and uncertain in a way she hadn't looked in the cockpit. Reporters shouted questions. She answered most with brief, technical responses, defaulting to the factual and concrete because emotions were harder. Yes, she'd been training for 3 years. Yes, she'd used professional-grade simulators. Yes, she understood the risks of what she'd done. Yes, she'd known her odds of success were low. No, she didn't consider herself a hero, she'd just applied knowledge to a problem. Then someone asked, "How did you stay so calm? How does a 12-year-old keep her composure in a situation like that when a veteran pilot was panicking?" Zara looked down at her hands, folded on the table in front of her. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but clear, projecting through the microphones to every corner of the room. Because someone had to. Captain Brennan is a good pilot. One of the best. His record proves it. But he'd never seen this specific scenario. Nobody had, not in real life. It exists in the space between what's supposed to be impossible and what's technically survivable. She paused, organizing her thoughts. I'd seen it 67 times. I'd died in it 64 times. But I'd also survived it 3 times. That meant I had information he didn't. Experience he didn't. And in that moment, experience mattered more than age. "What made you think you could do what a veteran pilot couldn't?" another reporter asked. "I didn't think I could. I thought I might be able to." And might is better than definitely not. Zara looked up at the cameras, at the sea of faces watching her. "My father died because he didn't know something. Because his training didn't cover something. Because the scenario he faced existed in a blind spot of aviation safety, something that wasn't supposed to happen but did anyway. I couldn't save him. But I could learn from what killed him. I could make sure someone else's father came home." The room fell silent. Several reporters had tears in their eyes. Even the camera operators looked moved. Captain Brennan, sitting beside her, spoke for the first time. "I want to be absolutely clear about something. This child, this extraordinary young woman, saved 198 lives because she knew things I didn't. Not because she was smarter or braver, but because she prepared for a scenario I hadn't imagined. She wasn't playing games on that tablet. She was training. Seriously training. And when the moment came, when everything I knew failed me, she was ready." He turned to look at Zara directly. "Age doesn't matter when you know how to save lives. Years of experience don't matter when you've studied something deeper than anyone else has. What matters is knowledge, preparation, and the courage to act when action is needed. This child had all three. She saved my life. She saved Sarah's life. She saved 198 people because she refused to accept that we were going to die." A reporter asked one final question, "Zara, what will you do now?" She thought about it, her expression serious. "Keep learning. Keep training. Because there are other scenarios out there. Other emergencies that people aren't prepared for. Other blind spots in aviation safety that nobody's thinking about until they happen." She touched the NASA logo on her shirt, the same one her father had worn. "My father wanted to fly to the stars someday. I want to make sure everyone who flies comes home safely. That seems like a good way to honor him. That seems like the best way to make his death mean something." 6 months later, the FAA announced new training protocols based directly on Zara's emergency response. Simulator scenarios would now include multiple cascading system failures of the type she'd faced. Emergency procedure manuals were updated to include the kind of creative problem-solving and unconventional solutions Zara had demonstrated. Several aviation schools requested her input on curriculum development, wanting to understand her methodology. Captain Brennan returned to flying after 3 months of counseling and additional training focused on managing scenarios outside normal procedures. He requested Zara as a consultant for his airline's safety program. She accepted, becoming the youngest aviation safety advisor in history, working part-time around her school schedule. First Officer Sarah Chin completed her captain upgrade training with flying colors. During her final check ride, she faced a simulated emergency similar to what they'd experienced. She handled it perfectly, telling the examiner afterwards, "I learned from the best. She was 12 years old and she saved my life. If she could stay calm and solve problems under those conditions, I can handle anything a simulator throws at me." Marcus Webb, the businessman from 22B, established a scholarship fund for aviation education in Zara's name, funded with a significant portion of his savings. "She gave me more time with my daughters," he explained at the fund's launch. "How do you put a price on that? You don't. You pay it forward." The fund would eventually help dozens of students pursue aviation careers. Jennifer Park sent Zara letters every month with photos of her son growing up, first steps, first words, first birthday. Each letter ended the same way, "Thank you for his life. Thank you for giving me more time with him." Harold and Margaret Chin visited Zara on the anniversary of the emergency landing, bringing flowers and gratitude and stories about their granddaughter's wedding that they'd lived to see. "You gave us that," Margaret said simply. "Thank you." And Zara kept training. She upgraded her simulators with money from speaking fees and consulting work. She expanded her scenarios to include other aircraft types, other emergencies, other ways things could go catastrophically wrong and possibly be saved. She corresponded with pilots, engineers, safety inspectors, accident investigators, anyone who could teach her something new about how to keep people safe in the sky. Because somewhere out there, on a random afternoon at 20,000 feet, there might be another father who didn't know something. Another crew facing an impossible situation. Another 198 people who needed someone to refuse to let them die. And Zara Mitchell, daughter of Captain David Mitchell, was determined to be ready. Zara stood in the simulator facility at Boeing's training center in Seattle, now 15 years old and somehow both taller and still small for her age. The faded NASA t-shirt had been retired to a frame on her bedroom wall, replaced by a jacket from the Civil Air Patrol and a worn hoodie from MIT's Aviation Engineering Early Acceptance Program where she was studying part-time. Captain Brennan stood beside her as she configured the simulator for a new scenario, visiting regularly now as both colleague and friend. Their relationship had evolved into something between mentor and student, though neither was quite sure who held which role anymore. Sometimes she taught him. Sometimes he taught her. Mostly they learned together. This one's based on the Qantas flight that made an emergency landing in Singapore, Zara explained, pulling up technical data on the simulator's interface. Uncontained engine failure, but the interesting part is the multiple system damage that cascaded from it. I've been trying to find the optimal response sequence that minimizes risk while maintaining control. How many times have you run it? Brennan asked, settling into the co-pilot seat. 47. Survived 12 times, but only 3 of those were what I'd call clean survivals with minimal injuries. The others involved some pretty hard landings, injured passengers, or aircraft damage that could have been avoided with better technique. Still better odds than the real crew faced when it was happening to them in real time. The real crew did amazingly well. I'm not trying to criticize them. Zara settled into the simulator seat, hands moving across controls she knew better than most professional pilots with decades of experience. I'm just looking for what perfect would look like. What we could train people to do if they ever face this again. Brennan smiled. Want me to fly co-pilot? When do I not? As the simulation loaded, Zara glanced at a photograph taped to the edge of the simulator panel. Captain David Mitchell in his uniform, standing beside a 737, smiling proudly. The photo had come with her everywhere for 3 years now. Miss him? Brennan asked quietly. Every single day, Zara admitted. But I think I'm starting to understand what he loved about flying. It's not just the technical challenge or the problem solving or even the machines themselves. It's the responsibility. Knowing that your knowledge, your preparation, your decisions, they matter. They can save lives. They can bring people home to their families. He'd be incredibly proud of you. You know that, right? Zara smiled, small and sad and real. I hope so. I hope he knows that what happened to him meant something. That it changed things. That it led to better training and new procedures and maybe saved other people. That his daughter learned from it and made sure other people's parents came home. I think he knows, Brennan said gently. And I think he's grateful that his passion became yours, even though the path there was heartbreaking. You turned tragedy into purpose. That's remarkable. The simulation started. Engine explosion at cruising altitude, system failures cascading through multiple aircraft systems, crisis escalating with each passing second. But in the simulator cockpit, a 15-year-old girl who turned grief into expertise and helplessness into preparation faced the emergency with calm, analytical certainty. She'd crashed 1,000 times learning how to survive. She'd saved 198 lives when it mattered most. And she'd keep learning, keep training, keep preparing for the next impossible scenario that existed in the space between catastrophe and salvation. Because at 20,000 feet, when everything fails and hope dies and protocol offers no answers, someone needs to know what to do. Someone needs to refuse to let everyone die. And Zara Mitchell had decided that someone would always be her. For her father. For the passengers on Flight 447. For everyone who ever trusted their life to the miracle of flight. The simulator aircraft began its emergency descent, and her hands moved across the controls with the practiced grace of someone who'd been training for exactly this moment. Just like she'd trained for every moment. Just like she'd never stopped training. Because somewhere in the sky, someone might need her knowledge. And she refused to let them die the way her father had. Not now. Not ever.